He was the soldier the Führer praised in public and summoned in private, the man whose desert victories were broadcast across radio waves and whose face sold confidence to a nation. He was a frontline commander who led from the turret of a tank and a myth machine that Joseph Goebbels enjoyed polishing. So why, if Erwin Rommel began the war as Hitler's favorite field marshal, did he end it as someone named in the conspirators' files, forced into a choice between poison and disgrace? Why did Rommel turn against Hitler? To answer that, we must follow a life shaped by trenches and maneuver, by battlefield success and mounting strategic horror, and by choices that balanced duty, honor, and a dwindling hope for Germany's survival. Rommel's story begins not with triumph or treason, but with the ordinary scaffolding of a German officer's life. A veteran of the First World War, hardened by the mud and machine gun barrages that devoured a generation, Rommel learned early the costs of rigid command and the value of initiative. The interwar years honed a mind that admired movement and surprise. The 7th Panzer Army he led in 1940 moved with the audacity of a cavalry charge, translated into steel and radio, winning him a nickname, the Desert Fox, that would follow him like a talisman. Behind that public image was a father, a husband, and a commander who believed in duty to his men and in a professional ethic rooted in battlefield effectiveness rather than ideology. Manfred Rommel, his son, later became one of the principal human witnesses to his father's private side. In wartime and again in later interviews, he painted a picture of a man for whom military professionalism was not simply technique, it was character. That human angle matters when trying to understand why Rommel's relationship with Hitler changed. He was not a dogmatic anti-Nazi in the mold of later conspirators. He was, to begin with, an officer who rose by demonstrating what he could do under fire. That competence bought him remarkable latitude. In the deserts of North Africa, it turned into autonomy. North Africa was where Rommel's tactical flair and Hitler's immediate political needs met. The Afrika Korps arrived as a reinforcement intended to bolster Italian forces against the British. Rommel, however, transformed the theater. He took risks other commanders would not. He improvised. He exploited terrain, supply, and the psychology of opponents, pushing tanks in daring encirclements, using speed to create local superiority against numerically superior foes. His forces took Tobruk in 1942, a victory that resonated far beyond the empty beaches and dusty fortifications. It was a symbolic coup that eased a domestic audience's fears and burnished the image of a leader who could still win. That success produced two interlocking effects. First, it convinced many in Berlin, Hitler among them, that Rommel was indispensable. He was publicly lauded, his image amplified by propaganda. Goebbels saw in Rommel a figure who could be presented as the ideal soldier, heroic, modest in demeanor, and ostentatiously apolitical. Second, Rommel's battlefield success conferred breathtaking operational latitude. Commanders on the ground normally answered to a rigid staff system. Rommel, however, increasingly exercised initiative without prior approval. He bypassed slow bureaucracy. He demanded freedom to act and, in the short term, was rewarded for it. The Führer admired results. So long as Rommel delivered, distance and deferential silence from Berlin were the price of victory. But victory in the field can disguise strategic fragility. North Africa exposed an uncomfortable truth. Tactical brilliance does not erase logistical reality. Rommel's advances repeatedly stretched supply lines to breaking point. Ports were distant, shipping routes vulnerable to Allied interdiction, and gasoline and ammunition were finite. Rommel's operational tempo, rapid thrusts, wide envelopments, consumed resources faster than the Axis could replace them. Where his enemies had industrial depth and maritime control, his forces had daring and a precarious grip on fuel. That mismatch mattered more than personality. The desert favored audacity but punished overreach. There were also intelligence realities Rommel either misread or downplayed. The Allies' advantage in signals intelligence, what would later be called ultra, gave them an edge in predicting German movements and intentions. Rommel at times assumed a stronger degree of secrecy in German communications than was warranted. He believed too readily that boldness could mask the frailties of supply and coordination. Whether he was aware of the scale of Allied code-breaking is debated. What is clear is that German command structures, including Rommel's theater, suffered from misleading assumptions about their operational security. The result was repeated frustration. Plans that should have worked failed because the enemy anticipated them, and Rommel, used to winning by surprise, began to meet a foe that heard the drums before Rommel began the march. Those defeats and near misses were not merely professional setbacks. They were the first cracks in a relationship between a soldier who prized competence and a political leadership increasingly divorced from military reality. Hitler's oscillation between micromanagement and blind faith aggravated the problem. When a dictator alternates between ignoring his generals and overruling them at critical moments, the result is a distorted command climate. Rommel's earlier autonomy had been tacitly tolerated because it produced results. But when those results became rarer, the same independence that had been admired in 1941 and 1942 started to look like a challenge to centralized control. It is here that the story of affection shifts toward the story of tension. The broader strategic landscape made those tensions existential. The German defeat at Stalingrad in early 1943 was a seismic blow. It was not simply the loss of an army, it was a collapse of an entire strategic calculus. Where once Germany could hope to absorb setbacks on the periphery, Stalingrad revealed that the Eastern Front had become a furnace consuming men, material, and morale at rates the Reich could not sustain. For commanders like Rommel, who had watched and fought elsewhere, the catastrophe in the East forced a reckoning. Even if one disagreed about political culpability, it was hard to deny that the war's center of gravity had shifted in ways that imperiled Germany's strategic position. For Rommel, Stalingrad was significant in two overlapping ways. Operationally, it meant that the Wehrmacht's reserves were being bled white. A front that needed depth and freedom of movement now required vast replacements and strategic coherence that Germany lacked. Morally, reports of what was happening on the Eastern Front began to filter outward, not as rumors to be dismissed, but as accounts that could not be reconciled with a professional soldier's sense of honor. The Wehrmacht's complicity in war crimes, the scale of mass executions, and the industrialized brutality of the camps were, at first, information arriving in fragments. Historians still dispute how fully and how early Rommel understood the contours of these atrocities. What is documented, however, is that increasing evidence and testimony reached him, and that those facts complicated the simple loyalty to the regime that a professional officer might otherwise have maintained. This is where a second dimension enters, the moral as distinct from the military. Rommel's reputation had been built on a code: treat soldiers fairly, avoid wanton brutality, fight honorably. The character of the Nazi regime increasingly contradicted this code. Men experienced in combat have often tolerated harsh political systems as long as the instruments of state serve military ends without descending into criminality. But the reports from the East suggested a systematic criminal enterprise that was not merely a hard edge of policy, but an organized deformation of the state. For Rommel, that deformation posed an ethical dilemma. To be an effective soldier under those conditions required either willful blindness or active complicity. Where the evidence was partial, his response was cautious, but the pattern of his responses indicates a shifting conscience. At the same time, the political uses of Rommel's fame complicated his options. Propaganda had turned him into a symbol. That symbol both protected him and made him politically valuable. Goebbels exploited that image. Images of Rommel visiting wounded soldiers, of his boots dusty from the front, of postcards home, served to reassure a German public unnerved by losses elsewhere. But a symbol can be a double-edged sword. It presented Rommel as a potential rallying point for dissent, whether or not he intended to be one. The more his private unease inched toward public disagreement with strategy, the more dangerous his standing became to a regime inclined to purge any perceived betrayal. North Africa could have been a refuge for a career soldier content to remain focused on tactical problems. Instead, the campaign became a school in strategic humility. Defeats there were not merely the result of battlefield misfortune. They were symptoms: inadequate shipping, overstretched lines, a lack of realistic political support for the theater's demands. When Rommel pushed forward and Berlin failed to secure his back, it hardened his view about the limits of military action divorced from political reality. That hardening did not immediately translate into political opposition. Rommel was, by nature and by precedent, reluctant to substitute political judgment for military counsel. Yet the accumulation of setbacks, the strategic reorientation after Stalingrad, and the moral reports from the East combined into a new posture. A commander who could no longer trust that continuing the same path would preserve anything worth defending. By mid-1943, the facts converged. Rommel's forces in North Africa were exhausted and ultimately forced into retreat. Axis troops surrendered in Tunisia in May 1943. The defeat closed the Mediterranean as an easy avenue for Axis supply and eliminated the last theater in which Rommel's style could obscure systemic failure. He left Africa with a reputation still intact in many eyes, but with the awareness that German strategic depth was evaporating. He returned to Europe into a military and political environment that was more brittle than when he had left. His tactical mobility was now matched by Allied industrial supremacy and by an intelligence advantage that allowed the Allies to choose the time and place of confrontation. Back in Europe, Rommel confronted a new set of problems: how to defend a long coastline against an enemy with overwhelming sea and air power, how to advise a political leadership that oscillated between denial and fatalism, and how to reconcile a soldier's code with the crimes and barbarities being revealed. He began to emphasize a defense in depth, mobile reserves, and an honest appraisal of where the Reich could realistically hold ground. Positions that too often clashed with directives from Hitler, who favored centralized control and rigid retention of territory regardless of tactical cost. The tension is notable because it framed Rommel's emerging posture. Not a man who sought to topple a dictator out of personal ambition, but a field commander convinced that Hitler's strategic missteps were dooming Germany to ruin. Poorly supplied, constantly micromanaged, and increasingly haunted by moral questions, Rommel's thinking turned in a direction that made his relationship with Hitler fragile. The man who had once received praise on the Führer's lips was now warning of collapse if policies did not change. He was not alone in this assessment among certain military circles, but he was uniquely dangerous because his public profile lent credibility to any criticism. That credibility made him both an asset and an irritant for the regime. It would soon make him a target. At the heart of the question, why did Rommel turn against Hitler, are several intertwined threads. One is strategic realism. Rommel saw, increasingly clearly, that the military foundation of the Reich was eroding and that continuing the current policies would only prolong devastation. A second thread is moral unease. Fragments of knowledge about mass murder and the Wehrmacht's role in criminal acts gnawed at the professional ethic that had shaped him. A third is honor and constitutionalism. Rommel reportedly distrusted assassination as a remedy. He preferred lawful removal and negotiation if conceivable. A fourth is political pragmatism. Some gestures, harsh as they may sound, were aimed not at avenging victims, but at preserving a remnant of Germany from total destruction. These threads were visible by mid-1943, but the story does not pivot neatly from loyal general to conspirator overnight. The transformation was gradual, complicated by accident, by hesitance, and by the unique pressures of serving under a paranoid and ideologically driven leadership. The degree to which Rommel moved from concern to active political involvement is debated among historians. Some argue that he remained fundamentally a soldier who sought to influence policy by counsel and persuasion, not by assassination. Others see in his later actions a willingness to accept the removal of Hitler by arrest and trial rather than by murder as a legitimate safeguard for the nation. What remains clear is that his later willingness to countenance the Führer's removal, even if only by legal means, placed him on the wrong side of the regime's threshold for tolerable dissent. Before we move to examine the crucial episodes that followed, Rommel's arrival in France to prepare coastal defenses, the deception of the Allies, the shock of D-Day, the July 1944 letter that signaled a political break, and the brutal aftermath that culminated in his enforced death, there is one more piece to understand: the personal. Manfred Rommel remembered his father as a man who took responsibility seriously. When the tide of events changed and the moral calculus shifted, it did not convert Erwin Rommel into a politician. It wore on him as a father, as a commander, and as a public figure increasingly trapped between professional duty and an unspeakable political reality. If Rommel's turn was driven by any single moment, history has not fixed upon it. More plausibly, his reversal emerged from the slow accretion of military defeats that stripped away illusions, the growing weight of evidence about systemic criminality that contradicted his code of honor, and the strategic imperative to prevent the total destruction of his country. Yet those are explanations, not absolutions. They help us understand motive without excusing moral ambiguity. They reveal why a man who had been a model of battlefield initiative might increasingly seek political solutions, and why that shift would, in a regime of terror, become fatal. Now, as Rommel prepared to take on the command that would make his name again a national symbol, new pressures gathered on the horizon. Allies were regrouping in Britain, their air and sea superiority growing. Berlin expected a defense that could repel an amphibious invasion at the coastline, a stop-them-in-the-water approach. But Rommel's experience in maneuver warfare made him skeptical of static fortifications. The Atlantic Wall was an enormous construction project, and Rommel saw in it the illusion of security. He favored mobile reserves, flexibility, and pragmatic use of limited resources. This disagreement was not simply technical, it was a clash of war philosophies. For Rommel, the question was practical: how best to make a limited set of forces effective in defense? For Hitler and many in the high command, the question had become political. The retention of territory at any cost was itself an act of will. On the eve of the Allied invasion, Rommel's insistence on concentrating forces where he believed the landing would come and on keeping armored reserves capable of counterattack made strategic sense from a military perspective. It also infected his relationship with the regime. It suggested that military prudence might require breaking with politically driven orders. That suggestion, in wartime Germany, was dangerous. But it was also the moment when the seeds of his political engagement fell toward ripeness. If a legal, negotiated removal of Hitler seemed the only way to halt the catastrophe, then a field marshal with moral authority and popular recognition could become a decisive intermediary. Whether Rommel actively courted that role is unclear. Whether he would have accepted it is debated. What is not in doubt is that by the summer of 1944, he occupied a precarious middle ground between soldier and potential statesman, and that the choices available to men in that ground were narrowing fast. There is much more to the story: how deception operations misled German command, how Rommel was absent from the critical hours of the invasion, how a letter he penned in July would be read as a political act, and how a car accident and the July 20 plot would intersect his fate. Each of those episodes is a hinge where military detail, human tragedy, and moral ambiguity lock together. But the essential currents that pushed Rommel away from unquestioning loyalty are already visible: battlefield experience that exposed systemic weakness, moral revulsion that undercut ethical complacency, and political realism that sought legal remedies rather than private vengeance. These currents moved him imperceptibly from a celebrated executor of Hitler's military dreams to a man willing to consider removing the dreamer for the sake of the nation. If you find this unfolding journey compelling and want to stay with us as we unpack D-Day, the July letter, the accident, and the final weeks leading to Rommel's forced death, subscribe now. There are primary sources and recommended readings linked in the description for anyone who wants to dig deeper. The invasion that followed would test every assumption Rommel had made about defense in depth, about the value of mobile reserves, and about whether a soldier's duty could include political intervention. As Allied forces crossed the Channel and the Atlantic Wall was put to its most brutal test, the consequences of the strategic and moral debates that had been simmering for years suddenly became lethal decisions. Rommel's absence in the opening hours of that invasion, the misdirection of German intelligence, and the failure of German command to concentrate forces where they were needed would all be seen in the years to come as decisive. But at the time, for Rommel personally, the stakes were immediate and intimate: a nation's fate, the lives of his men, and the moral calculus of what a commander should do when his country's leadership appears bent on ruin. The scene shifts now from the wide sweep of campaigns to the narrow features of command staff rooms, coastal inspections, and private notes penned in urgency. Rommel's transformation, if that is the right word, was not made on a single field of battle. It emerged in the quiet calculations of a man who had learned the limits of daring. He understood the enemy's advantages, he had seen the cost of overreach, he had heard, in fragments, about crimes that violated his conception of honorable war. Those facts pushed him toward a position that would eventually be read as political defiance. But before the final acts could play out, other actors, some opportunistic, some desperate, would shape the possibilities he had left open. The next episodes would reveal how deception, timing, and accident combined to create a moment in which moral conviction and strategic calculation collided with fatal consequences. The deception that set the stage for D-Day was textbook manipulation, an Allied campaign of illusions designed to create certainty where none existed. Operation Fortitude fabricated an entire army group, complete with fake camps, dummy tanks, radio chatter, and a carefully cultivated trail of misinformation through double agents. From the German perspective, the result was coherent and persuasive. Allied strength appeared concentrated at Pas-de-Calais, and the crossing of the Channel seemed at once inevitable and at a point distant from Normandy. For a commander like Rommel, who read the map in terms of where men in armor could be decisive, that error in German assessment was not merely a failure of intelligence, it translated into a fatal misallocation of reserves and a denial of the mobility he had long insisted was essential. Rommel's position in early June 1944 was complicated by more than misdirection. He had argued repeatedly for the authority to deploy armored reserves flexibly, close to the coast, ready to counterattack at the decisive point. The High Command, and above all Hitler, had insisted on a degree of central control that left the field commanders waiting for permission to move. Moreover, on the morning of the invasion, Rommel was not at his headquarters. He was in Germany, either for a brief visit to his wife and family or to consult on matters of defense. Accounts vary, and the precise reasons for that absence remain contested. What is not contested is the effect. When the first Allied armies hit the beaches, the German response was slower and more tentative than it might have been if the very man most able to execute a rapid counterpunch had been in place. In the hours and days that followed, Rommel returned to France and threw himself into the fight. He saw with painful clarity that the Atlantic Wall, so laboriously constructed with bunkers, hedgehogs, and anti-tank obstacles, was a graveyard for the idea that static defenses could turn back an attacker when air and naval superiority belonged to the enemy. The Allies had achieved overwhelming firepower and the ability to mass at the landing zones. Rommel's instinct to keep armored formations under central control in depth and to use them as decisive mobile reserves was vindicated tactically but obstructed politically. The German command structure, already tangled by Hitler's micromanagement and competing loyalties, could not execute the sort of synchronized counterattack Rommel believed necessary. Fortitude's success in fixing attention on Pas de Calais had a deeper psychological effect. Hitler remained convinced the Normandy landings were a feint. His reluctance to release armored divisions, kept as a strategic reserve against the real invasion, meant that German troops in Normandy faced a cataclysm with too few tools to respond. Rommel's fury at this misjudgment was not merely professional embarrassment, it was existential. He knew what mobile warfare required, and he saw the highest levels of command insisting on a course that threw these requirements away. For a soldier who had once been praised by the Führer himself, a growing gulf opened between professional necessity and political will. The invasion, the hedgerow battles that followed, and the eventual Allied breakout confirmed a reality Rommel had warned of. Germany's material inferiority and the Allies' control of the sea and sky made it increasingly unlikely that Germany could repel an amphibious incursion. For Rommel, this was not just a matter of defeat. It was a confirmation that the regime's choices, strategic, ideological, and criminal, were leading Germany toward ruin. That conviction deepened the pre-existing moral unease that had crept into his thinking since Stalingrad and the reports from the East. It is important to stress how slowly Rommel's political posture changed. He did not become a conspirator at a single instant. The line between military counsel and political action is often porous in wartime, and Rommel walked it cautiously. Evidence suggests he preferred legal, public remedies, arrest, trial, removal, to clandestine assassination. That preference was rooted in his sense of honor and in a conservative belief that the state should be preserved through law rather than extra-legal violence. But as Germany's situation deteriorated, and as some members of the resistance and military conspirators concluded that only a swift and silent assassination could avert catastrophe, Rommel found himself in an increasingly awkward middle. On July 15, 1944, Rommel took a step that many contemporaries read as political. He penned a letter to Hitler, a missive that historians have paraphrased and analyzed, urging negotiations and, in effect, that Hitler be sidelined so that Germany might seek a settlement. The exact wording and intent are debated. Some historians see the letter as a dramatic break, evidence that Rommel had reconciled himself to the necessity of forcible political change. Others insist it was a plea for caution, a desperate attempt to avert complete national destruction by advising a legal process rather than any violent overthrow. What is unambiguous is that the letter marked a visible, publicized divergence from the loyalty he had earlier shown, and it placed him in a precarious position vis-à-vis the Führer and the secret police. Just 2 days later, on July 17, fate intervened in a brutal and immediate way. Rommel was severely wounded in what is often described as a car accident, an episode whose precise circumstances have been variously recounted. Some accounts emphasize strafing by Allied aircraft, others describe a collision and confusion on a narrow road. Whatever the immediate cause, Rommel's injuries were serious, his skull fractured and his health compromised. He was evacuated and spent weeks recuperating in a hospital, first in France and then in Germany. The timing of the injury could not have been worse, or, for some, not better, depending on the perspective. It removed Rommel from the center of command just as the July 20th assassination attempt on Hitler unfolded. The bomb that exploded at the Wolf's Mare on July 20 sent shockwaves through Germany and precipitated a ferocious purge. Conspirators, military officers, civil servants, and aristocrats were arrested, tried in kangaroo courts, or executed. The regime responded with ruthless efficiency. In the wake of the plot, names circulated, accusations flew, and proximity to dissent became tantamount to guilt. Rommel, already under suspicion because of his July letter and his well-known frustrations with Hitler, found himself implicated in rumors and intelligence reports. Some conspirators reportedly viewed him as a desirable figure to head a post-coup government because of his stature and public credibility. Whether Rommel actively endorsed such a plan remains debated. What matters for our central question is that the association altered his fate. The regime's approach to Rommel was both pragmatic and vindictive. Hitler, perhaps wary of the public reaction that a show trial might provoke against a beloved field marshal, offered Rommel an ultimatum: face public exposure and the likely humiliation and repression of his family, or take his own life quietly and allow the state to treat his death as an honorable end. It is a chilling choice, one that reveals how totalitarian power calculates loyalty and expediency. Rommel, weakened by injury and assailed by the knowledge that his family's welfare was at stake, accepted the poison on October 14, 1944. He was given a state funeral and the trappings of honor, while the regime framed the episode as a noble end chosen by a patriotic soldier. Manfred Rommel later described his father's final hours with a mixture of sorrow and reluctant acceptance. He remembered a man who sought to protect his loved ones and to preserve a degree of dignity in impossible circumstances. Historians have long wrestled with the morality and meaning of Rommel's last choices. Some interpret his acceptance of suicide as evidence of compromise, an acquiescence to the regime and its demands. Others emphasize the coercive context. The offer of death or public disgrace was not a choice among equals, but an extortion designed to silence. The truth likely lies between. Rommel made a tragic, pragmatic decision aimed at shielding family and comrades, while knowing full well that the state's honorable treatment would be a propaganda coup. The regime's eagerness to exploit his image did not end with his death. It continued through the posthumous honors and the carefully orchestrated burial that the Nazis allowed precisely because it served their narrative. Beyond the immediate drama, Rommel's death catalyzed ongoing debates about personal responsibility and historical judgment. Was he a soldier who gradually recognized the criminal nature of the regime and sought to act within the confines of his professional ethics? Or was he a man whose public silence and occasional cooperation with Nazi propaganda made him complicit? Scholars have marshaled evidence for both positions. Documents show that Rommel did not publicly endorse the regime's racial policies and that he made efforts to protect prisoners of war in certain instances. Yet he also accepted promotions, took counsel from Hitler, and benefited from propaganda that obscured the regime's crimes. On the question of the Holocaust and the Wehrmacht's role in atrocities, the record is complex. Rommel appears to have been aware of some aspects of the brutality on the Eastern Front, but there is no definitive documentation that he orchestrated or approved of the genocidal policies. The extent and timing of his knowledge remains subject to debate. The historiographical conversation has shifted over time. Earlier, hagiographic accounts presented Rommel as an apolitical, chivalrous soldier, an emblem of clean Wehrmacht conduct. Later scholarship, with access to more archival material and a deeper understanding of the Wehrmacht's complicity in Nazi crimes, has complicated that picture. Recent studies emphasize that public image and private conduct are not the same. They insist on reading Rommel both as a product of his military culture and as an individual whose choices had moral weight. The result is a portrait that resists easy categorization. Rommel's tactical genius is undisputed, the moral story is ambiguous and demands nuance. Returning to our central question, why did Rommel turn against Hitler? The answer must be careful and multifaceted. Strategic realism constituted a primary strand. Rommel repeatedly concluded that Germany's capacity to wage successful wide-scale war was collapsing, and that continuing on the existing path would destroy what remained of the nation. That assessment reflected his operational experience in North Africa, his observation of Allied material superiority, and the crushing loss of manpower on the Eastern Front. Moral revulsion formed a second significant strand. Fragmentary reports and testimony from the front exposed a pattern of criminality that conflicted with his professional ethos. The reality of industrialized brutality and the Wehrmacht's involvement in it unsettled his sense of honor. A third strand was constitutionalist and legalistic. Rommel seems to have distrusted assassination as a means of political change. He preferred, at least publicly, to advocate for legal processes and negotiation. Finally, political pragmatism, an attempt to preserve some remnant of Germany and minimize further destruction, infused his late war calculations. These motives did not operate in isolation. Personal factors, concern for his family, health, and public reputation, shaped his willingness to take risks. Institutional constraints, Hitler's micromanagement, the SS's political power, and the stubborn loyalty of many Wehrmacht officers limited what Rommel could realistically accomplish by counsel alone. And external events, Allied deception, the shock of D-Day, the wreckage of Stalingrad, accelerated the timeline, forcing decisions that might otherwise have been delayed or avoided. We must also concede what the documentary record will not allow: certainty about Rommel's inner life. The archival traces, letters, official reports, third-party recollections, offer a partial map, but they cannot reveal thoughts unexpressed or intentions unrecorded. Where historians differ, we should listen to the disagreement as instructive. Some interpret a pattern of private objections and a public face of compliance as evidence of a man trapped between conscience and duty. Others argue that silence in the face of atrocity is itself a moral failure that must be weighed against battlefield valor. Both readings are compatible with much of the evidence. Neither can claim absolute primacy without trespassing into speculation. What remains incontrovertible is the cost of dissent under a totalitarian regime. Rommel's evolution from celebrated field marshal to a man forced to choose poison over public humiliation demonstrates how limited the options are for those who seek to correct a destructive course within a system that equates dissent with treason. His choice to advocate for legal removal rather than endorse assassination reflects a particular moral reasoning, one rooted in the rule of law and an officer's code. Yet that very insistence on legality did not protect him from the regime's mechanisms of control and reprisal. Rommel's legacy, like his life, is contested. To many in post-war Germany and abroad, he remained a figure of military brilliance and, for some, a symbol of the possibility of honorable opposition within the Wehrmacht. To others, his earlier proximity to the Nazi leadership and his failure to speak out more forcefully render any retrospective praise problematic. Modern scholarship tends towards synthesis. Acknowledge Rommel's tactical genius, recognize his growing disillusionment, insist on the limits of his opposition, and hold firm that admiration for soldierly skill does not absolve moral responsibility. There is a lesson that seems to emerge from this tangled narrative, one that transcends the particulars of the man and era. Competence can win praise, and fame can grant freedom. But fame can also bind a person to political uses they did not anticipate. Military skill does not automatically confirm moral clarity, and moral clarity does not always translate into effective political action under tyranny. Rommel's story is a cautionary tale about the limits of professional ethics when confronted with systemic criminality, and about the perilous tightrope walked by those who remain inside instruments of a repressive state while seeking to avert catastrophe. In the end, when asked directly why Rommel turned against Hitler, we can offer a composite answer. He was pushed by strategic evidence that the war was unwinnable under current leadership. He was pulled by moral unease at what the state had become. He was constrained by a professional disposition that privileged legal and institutional remedies over clandestine murder. And he was forced, by injury and circumstance, into decisions that curtailed his agency. The balance among these factors is debated, and rightly so. The historical record supports a reading in which all these elements contributed, in varying degrees, to a turn that was gradual, ambivalent, and ultimately tragic. Rommel's name endures in history not as an unquestioned hero, nor as a simple villain, but as a complex figure whose life and death illuminate the moral dilemmas facing military leaders under criminal regimes. His tactical legacy, the daring maneuvers, the innovations in armored warfare, the capacity to inspire troops, is part of military history. His political and moral legacy, the letter, the doubts, the final choice, is part of a deeper human story about conscience, duty, and the costs of speaking truth to power when power answers with violence. If you want to explore the primary sources behind this account, Rommel's correspondence, Manfred Rommel's recollections, wartime records, and the rich body of scholarship that includes both sympathetic and critical studies, links to recommended readings and archival documents are in the description. Dive into the documents and judge for yourself. Do you see Rommel as a patriot trying to preserve his country, as a pragmatist who placed preservation above confrontation, or as a more complex figure who embodied both courage and moral compromise? Share your thoughts in the comments. History is best examined together.